So the poor vizier took his clothes off, and as soon as he went underwater, he found himself changed into a woman standing in the riverbank. The Bedouin came with a stick in his hand and started whipping her, shouting, "You daughter of 60 dogs, you take all day to wash some clothes. Beat, beat, beat." She jumped into the water, and as soon as she went under, she found herself changed back into the vizier, standing in the bathtub. When he got out, and he said to the Sultan, "Your Majesty, I think we should marry your daughter to the dervish's son." The Sultan answered, "This is the best counsel you have ever given." The marriage took place, and they celebrated it for 40 nights and 40 days. And before the dervish left, he said to Hassan, "Remember that fish you returned to the water 3 times? That was I. And I was there and just returned." Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. I'm Ian, and today we're going to talk about Alan Dundes' Fairy Tales from a Folkloristic Perspective. This is, I was going to say short and sweet, but although it is short, it is not sweet. This is basically Alan Dundes, who was one of that generation, and you could make an argument that he was the tip of the spear of that generation of folklorists that emerged in the 1960s to throw off the shackles of the item-obsessed, collection-obsessed static approach to the discipline, and change it into the dynamism of looking at things in performance context and taking the practices of folk culture seriously. He was also a Freudian, which is fun. You can challenge all the benefits of it, but at least he was consistent with it. And yes, he's a name to be struggled with, but in a very positive way. And one of the things that you kind of have the feeling about him is that he was brought in when people need to take someone to task. And that's what this article is very much about. I call it an article, but it's actually a contribution. It's a book chapter. It's in a book called Fairy Tales in Society, Allusion, and Paradigm. And if you read it, basically, he just has beef with all the other articles, not on a ad hominem basis. He's not attacking the authors themselves, but basically he's saying, you've just contributed to an anthology about fairy tale, and you have no idea what a fairy tale is. You have no idea what a folk tale is. Let me tell you, Buster. And it's kind of adorable. So, I mean, he emphasizes the fact that fairy tales, folk tales, and we'll talk about the title fairy tale in a minute, are oral. The books, all the other authors, or the plurality of the other authors, are looking at tales through the literary lens, as if they're fixed, as if a tale exists in a single version. And the whole point, he's giving some rudimentary folklore here, but the whole point is that a tale exists in multiple iterations, that no single instance of it is identical with another instance of it, that they go through processes of transmission, and that they go through subjects of variation. And we have this wealth of material, which is on one hand of benefit, because it does give us the stuff to begin to analyze, but it's also, certainly when we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries and early 20th centuries, it's of various sensitivities to the live performance of it. If you are only interested in these things as texts, and what is more, you are convinced that the text has some kind of existence outside of its mode of performance, that it is fundamentally a kind of transcript that you can grasp if you if you only can sort of see through the unfortunate conduit of the folk performing it, and you can find out what the actual integral tale is. You have, if that is your approach, I forgot my point to this. Right? Yes, you're going to be indelicate with how the texts are actually collected. You're basically going to get, I get the gist. Yeah, okay, because I'm going to hear your version of this thing, and I'm interested in the thing. I'm less interested in your version. I'm interested in your version only in as much as it gets me to the thing. The thing that we're arguing doesn't actually exist outside of its iteration of versions. I hope that's clear. I'm going to take a second and think, see if I need to rephrase that more succinctly. Yes, if you are, I use the words when I teach in this idea, the words of the folk being an unfortunate conduit. And that is the notion that there is some kind of original thought that is expressed that is only unfortunately available to us through performance, as opposed to looking at the performances as the raison d'etre, as the dynamic part of folk culture. And that only shift really occurred in the 20th century. Not entirely. There were very sensitive collections where multiple versions were recorded, that to the best of the ability, in a day before recording technology was there, in a time before recording technology was there, sensitivity to the actual verbal transcripts as opposed to sort of a general gist, and things like gesture, paying attention to who was there. E. Tang Christensen is a good example of that, and my colleague Timothy Tangerlini has done a lot on that collection, and there's a wonderful online database about Christensen's texts. And Afanasyev in Russia did something similar. Paying attention to these tale tellers as tellers, and not simply as maybe if we listen to Buddy we can get through it and find the original thing, because there is no original thing. There are stories that have persistence over time only in as much as they are regularly remembered at moments of performance as something that someone wishes to perform again. And that is that they exist through the generative act of performance, not through some kind of conduit. So, and to be fair, one of the things was the limitations of recording technology. We now have access, since writing this, of course, we have access to everyone having a camera in their phone and a video camera in their phone, and so many different recordings are possible. I think you do need to feel a little bit of sympathy when the only recording device was a quill and some parchment and getting something down. You're not going to get if you're trying to actually collect anything about that performance, you're not going to get something akin to it. It's really only with the advent of technology, first the field recordings of like the large wax plates, and then wax cylinders, and then wire recording, and then the advent of film cameras small enough and inexpensive enough that us poor humble folklorists could actually bring them out into the field, that you can really start to pay attention to performances and multiple performances over time. You have to think about the economics and the technology of collecting before you can inherently critique what happened in the 18th and 19th, and the pre-contemporary technological age that expands and opens up possibilities of collecting. But he's also quick to point out that people like the Grimms were knew about the idea of trying to capture the versions that were actually performed by the folk themselves, and then subsequently went ahead and edited them anyway. So they don't have, they have an excuse for not necessarily being able to record the way that they wished to record, but they don't have an excuse for then taking those things and changing them, because now he's coming back to his critique of the other authors in this book, where he is clear, saying that they are thinking of these things as some kind of text when they are fundamentally creations that are based on, perhaps only loosely based on, actual sort of oral traditions, but rendered into a text and then fixed, changed to sort of improve them, for whether improve them on the level of aesthetics, in terms of cleaning up the language, improve them in terms, if your attitude towards these texts, and many of them were, we have to put this into the context of nationalism, and that one of the reasons that people were collecting folktale is the idea that they somehow contained, alive in the spirit of the folk, they somehow contained insights into the national character. And so in the 18th and 19th century, when nationalism was emerging, like how to create these states that have their own identity, and their identity isn't defined by their relationship to the church, which, and therefore sort of Mediterranean culture, and so these aren't in the European context, Germany, England, Scandinavia, places that were not direct descendants of Romance languages and Latinate culture, were sort of, in a way, considered secondary. The language of the educated, the language of commerce, would have been, the language of church practice was Latin. The language of internationalism was French. And it's like, hold on a second. Why do we imagine ourselves lesser than these cultures? And so it was the birth of trying to come up with some kind of natural national culture. What is it to be English? What is it to be Scandinavian, Finnish, Swedish, Norwegian? What is it to be German? What is our culture, which is just at the same level as all these other cultures? Nationalism is a slippery slope, as you know, but that's one of the reasons why occasionally folklore is brought into disrepute, because of the role that folklorists, or rather the state, would manipulate the findings of folklore in order to engage in nationalist projects. And so, I mean, one of the ongoing things that we need to deal with as folklorists is folklore needs to struggle with nationalism in the same way that anthropology needs to struggle with sort of Orientalism and colonialism. I mean, they are sort of so the great sins of the discipline in many ways that we are redressing, but there's more redressing that's needed. So anyway, the Grimms were they would take the tales and they would improve them first for the levels of aesthetics, and then to make them often more chaste, to say, okay, well, if you have this idea that these tales informed something about the national character, and if you had this idea that they were directed towards children, which are parallel, especially in the 19th century when they started being explicitly directed towards children. But when I'm saying they, I'm saying the things that were now already rendered into text, and through publications like the Grimms themselves, it's like the creation of children's literature. Then you change them because you now want to inculcate a different character. So you have issues of masculinity, issues of femininity that weren't necessarily present in the organically collected tales, but you could spruce them out. So women became more passive, young girls became more passive as the various editions of the Grimms went forward. You would remove much sexuality, you would remove much anything that was sort of considered negative. They were bowdlerized. They were sort of made chaste, and that's a complicated thing to do. So they appear in multiple. So yeah, there is no. I love this particular sentence. there is no such thing as the text. There are only texts. So again, chastising his fellow contributors to this volume when they're saying that this is what Cinderella says. It's like, well, a version of Cinderella could be interpreted as that, but that doesn't say anything about what Cinderella is. That says something about what that version is. And you can legitimately look at a particular version, and you can legitimately look at the version as it appears in the Grimms. But bear in mind that we're not talking about an actual folktale at this point. We are talking about a literary reconstruction of something, but then purporting to be folktale, purporting to be an actual product of the folk. And he invokes good old Richard Dawson's idea of fake lore, which is something, it's a problematic term. It's still useful. Not everything that is described as fake lore ought to be described as fake lore, because it becomes sort of a sweeping gesture. But the way that Dundes is defining it, he says, an item which the collector claims is genuine oral tradition, but which has been doctored or in some cases entirely fabricated by the purported collector. So yeah, it's a wonderful little thing. Now he talks about stuff like the tale type index as indicative, like, please, folklorists, or sorry, not folklorists, please, people contributing to this volume, people who want something to say about the fairy tale, consult these standard works. It would be like if some chemist didn't know about the periodic table of the elements and then just started mixing stuff together and says, this is how it works. And it's like, you might have made some kind of insight into that, but the work has been done already. And he talks about the tale type index, the Arne Thompson index. Since the writing of this, it has been updated again in the early 2000s. Hans-Jörg Uther did the next edition of the types of international folk tales. Boom! I bought my own version. This is when I sort of became a grown-up folklorist. This is when I said I should have my own tale type index. And this is just volume 1 of 3. It is a classification. It's a bibliography. And it's a way of assigning a name, assigning a number, and a standardized name to a text. So I use Cinderella in my examples all the time. Cinderella is ATU 510A, and the type has similar elements within it that collected from a multiplicity of places. There are tales that are shaped in a way that we can ascribe similarities to them so that we can confidently talk about them as a collective. But again, Cinderella doesn't exist. Cinderella only exists in terms of it being the constellation that is formed by the thousands and thousands of stars that clump together close to this thing. So, but there is no real text there. We only have it through the texts that are available to us, and that continue to be available to us. He also asks how global a phenomenon it is, because there are tales that are remarkably sweeping, but the process of tale, the process of telling these narratives that are understood locally as fiction, we can use whichever definition of tale that we want. Things that typically involve not simply unusual occurrences, but fanciful occurrences, but framed as fiction, framed as something that is on the cusp of entertainment, but probably has some kind of other functions and uses as well. That might be a phenomenon, an international phenomenon. It likely is an international phenomenon. Certainly the act of storytelling is. But the individual types, how broadly sweeping are they? Is what we understand as fairy tale anything more than a European or perhaps an Indo-European context? We will sometimes come across fairy tales in other cultures that seem to be more a result of sort of post-contact. So through syncretism, through a tale having emerged in a by the intersection of Indo-European cultures with the local population, but they are not necessarily from that kind of antediluvian time before time that we sometimes imagine our tales to be. So one of the things he asked, and it's particularly the fairy tale, because again, the contributors to this book are making sweeping judgments about fairy tales. It's like, well, the thing that you call a fairy tale, for one thing, stop it. Stop calling them fairy tales. For one thing, they don't involve fairies too often. Did I just say for one thing twice in a row? That's just sloppy. They don't involve fairies. There was it was a name that sort of got attributed to them largely through the publications of Andrew Lang, who was a 19th century folklorist, English folklorist, who published a series of very influential anthologies, again directed towards children, of fairy tale you got me doing it, Andrew Lang, collections of tales called the fairy books, and multiple colors: the blue fairy book, the green fairy book, the red fairy book, and so on. They sat nicely on a shelf, and sort of fairy tale became like Hoovers, like Tannoys, like Kleenex. They became something about how we refer to this entire genre. But how internationally sweeping are they? And the other thing is that these by focusing on he is not finding fault with Arne and Thompson and Uther, but by calling this an international genre, when fundamentally we are talking about, more or less, we are talking about a European, Indo-European genre. We are ignoring the fact that different cultures, indigenous cultures, for one, have different narratives with types, with versions, with all those sorts of things that haven't been collected. And the question is, do they have something that we would call fairy tale or the tales of magic? Would we have the ones that would fall under the numbering system of 300 to 749 in the Arne Thompson Uther index? Or are they something different? So already we just have this sort of typological question that's raised. But the other thing is that European culture has been influenced by literary culture and the publications of traditional tales. And I think what happens is, for example, blanking on the name, but I can find it, because I can find it on page 1. Yeah, Charles Perrault, there we go. Charles Perrault, who was a French folktale popularizer, won't quite use the word collector, but published the influential sort of Mother Goose. It appears that some of the tales that the Grimms collected probably entered into the repertoires of the people that they were collecting from, which weren't necessarily the folk themselves, but often things like servants and people who were from the folk but were available to them. They didn't venture into the woods too often. But these tales entered into a local repertoire, but from text. So these aren't German tales, these are French tales. And again, that's fine. That might be a criticism of the Grimms, but that's not a criticism of the folk themselves. And again, the folk always they're not purists. They take what is meaningful to them, whatever they have access to, and they adopt it into their repertoire. It's only in sort of subsequent reflection that they start imposing this hermeneutic of authenticity, the tyranny of remaining authentic. The folk, in their sort of natural contexts, don't do that too often. But all the sort of comparison that's taking place, and again, thinking of these as one version, we have the folk tales have been influenced by literature and influenced by literary versions of tales. They've also been expressly written, and he introduces the term Kunstmärchen, basically things, which was a phenomenon of the 19th century. Hans Christian Andersen is probably the best example of that. People who wrote tales in the style of traditional tale and then published that. And they have that veneer of folk authenticity. They might best be expressed as something like the folkloresque, in that they are meant to invoke, they make fuzzy allusions to fairy tale, to the phenomenon of folk tale, but they are not in and of themselves. They are artistic tales. They are some middle-class dude sitting down at a table and then writing in the style of. Again, I don't think Hans Christian Andersen is necessarily to blame, because he was now participating in this phenomenon that was happening in 19th century publications. I think people mistaking Hans Christian Andersen's tales for actual oral folk tales, that's the problem, and that's the problem that Dundes is pointing out. So one of the advantages of looking at non-Western tales is that they haven't been influenced by a literary turn in the same way. So you can actually see the dynamism of tradition as well. You also have, they won't necessarily check their versions against some kind of fixed version of it. One of the things that's really kind of interesting, and it's a strange phenomenon, but we see it in music, we see it in a whole bunch of different forms, is that what will happen is that there will be these things that are performed, again, organically, they are performed within a culture. The dynamic, all the talk that I had at the beginning of this video about passed along because it is important to pass them along, and they exist within the memories and the performances and the intentional re-performances of the folk themselves. They do not exist in any kind of manner outside of the folk themselves. But then someone comes along and collects them. Someone from out of town comes along and collects them. And then a version, a particular instance, one version, or worse, one composite version, somehow becomes privileged, somehow becomes enshrined. And that is that idea of sort of a fixed version. And then the folk themselves will often then defer. They might still be telling a version of this type, but they might go, I can't remember a bit, and they'll refer to a text. That's kind of awful if you think about it. But it's had that influence. Non-Western cultures don't necessarily have that critical mass of collections that have entered into the public consciousness that they will then use as correctives for their own performance flow. I think that's an interesting thing. He has a discussion towards the end about illustrations, and that he says there's no point, certainly from any folkloristic value, of talking about illustrations, because they are clearly a product of popular culture and high culture. Oral tales didn't have illustrations. And I said, they can be of benefit to study as popular culture, but don't mistake studying those as doing anything approaching having insight into the nature of fairy tale. And I've been formulating this idea over a while, because one of the disparagements that we have about folktale and fairy tale, this genre that we now call fairy tale, is how it has enshrined certain ideas. And I think, here's an example of how illustration has really damaged, I think, the folktale. The example I always use is, if you're telling a story, if someone is in a storytelling context and the narrative, what they pluck out, has to do with one of the characters is described as, oh, the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. Let's just give that as an example. When you say the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, the listener can conjure up that idea. And they can conjure up that idea based on their own concepts of beauty, based on how they understand it to be. Once you illustrate that, once you go down the road and say, hey, I'm doing up this version of fairy tales, and I need you to draw the most beautiful woman in the world, it crystallizes it, it enshrines it, it canonizes it, and all of a sudden you have this concept of beauty that can be indicative of something now shifted to a standard. He uses the example of dragons, which is one thing. And I think, that's a useful explanation. On page 265, why should the audience see the dragon as one particular professional illustrator depicts it? Is not the human imagination far more powerful than anything a single book illustrator could possibly draw? In the oral tale setting, each member of the audience is free to let his or her imagination create images without limit. And I think dragon, not an object of fear, is certainly something that the imagination is far more potent, and it allows the expansion of that idea. But then concepts of beauty, I think are really interesting. It's something more than the objects of fear. Because the objects of beauty, thinking about normalizing standards, all of a sudden that becomes reflective. And all of a sudden, because we're dealing with how humans are depicted and not imaginary beasts, it's like, oh, I don't look like that. That's interesting. There's been a lot of work. Jeana Jorgensen, has written a lot about how the body is depicted in, and she's focusing on the Grimms because she looks at the various editions and how beauty is understood through the Grimms and has been adapted over time. So that's an interesting digression and diversion from what I want to say. So again, this is a fairly short article. Short chapter. It's very useful because it sets this tone. So, okay, if you're going to start talking about fairy tales, know what you're talking about. Understand the concept of performance. Understand the critical apparatus, things like the motif index, things like the tale type index that one can use to explore, and think of the dynamism that was behind the creation of these texts, that there is no single text. And then come back, and now you can talk to Dr. Dundes, because now you know what you are talking about. I bid you well. I will see you soon. Pax.